Welcome back to Bio-3D Prep, more properties of matter in the cell. Still talking about the properties of matter, and in this lecture we're going to be focusing on the properties, the chemical and physical properties of ionic and molecular compounds. By the end of this lecture, you'll be able to describe the atomic structure of both ionic and molecular compounds. You'll be able to explain the structure of ionic and molecular compounds in terms of ionic and covalent bonds. You'll be able to classify a compound based on physical and chemical properties. You'll be able to explain the empirical properties in terms of ionic and molecular bonds. And you'll be able to predict the state of simple molecular compounds based on their structure. So the first thing we're going to look at are ionic structures. Now, if we take a look back and just recall some of the stuff we've learned, ionic compounds consist of a metal and the nonmetal. And electrons have been transferred from the metal to the nonmetal. So what this creates are a bunch of positive ions and a bunch of negative ions that become attracted to each other. And what you'll see is every single positively charged sphere is surrounded by negatively charged spheres around it. So here we have a two-dimensional diagram of sodium chloride, and if you take a look, every positively charged particle is surrounded by negatively charged ones, or you can look at it the other way around as well. The negatively charged particles are surrounded by the positively charged ones. It means the same thing, but what this does is it tightly packs our atoms together, or our ions together. This results in a very tight, organized, and regular pattern of atoms called a crystal lattice. This is also why all are solids at STP. All ionic compounds are solid at STP because these strong bonds are attracting the positive and negative ions to each other. So for ionic compounds, the chemical formula that we look at, what it really does is it represents the ratio between cations and anions in this crystal lattice. So much different than when we look at molecular compounds, we're going to see something very different. For ionic compounds, what this NaCl really represents is that for every one sodium ion, we also have one chloride ion. So if we take any sample of salt, you would find an equal number of ions in that sample. Molecular structures are very different. Remember, molecular compounds are about sharing electrons. And one way to look at it is there's only so many people you can share with, or if you're an atom, there's only so many different atoms that you can share electrons with, so you end up with discrete structures. So for example, ammonia is an NH3 molecule. It has one nitrogen surrounded by three hydrogens, and that's it. That is one molecule of ammonia. It's not attracted to any other ammonia molecules. There's no great big structure where all the hydrogens are attracted to all the nitrogens. Each one is a discrete unit. So each atom is attracted only to the atom with which it shares electrons with, which means each molecule is a separate entity or a discrete entity. This is why they're more likely to be liquids or gases, is because you don't have a whole bunch of things attracted to each other. You have maybe 3 or 4 atoms in a group, and that's it. And they're all happy, they all have their valence energy shell fold, none of them have charges on them, so they're not attracted to anything else. So when we take a look at structures, here's what we can see. Ionic structures are going to form crystal lattices, and the ratio could change. Here we have calcium fluoride. It turns out that for every one calcium, we end up with 2 fluoride ions. It could be 1-to-1 ratio. Here we have cesium chloride, 1-to-1 ratio. The ratio depends on how many electrons have to be transferred. So the ratio depends on the number of electrons each one needs to transfer for stability. when we look at non-molecular or molecular compounds, so something like ammonia, here we see, here's a sample of ammonia over on this side of the screen, and what we can see is each molecule is a separate thing, not attracted to the other molecules by any really strong force. Now, there's a little bit of caveat to that. Some molecular compounds exhibit polar bonding or polar molecules. This results when things don't share equally. So if we take a look at, these are water molecules where we have a oxygen, and each oxygen is sharing electrons with hydrogens. And it turns out that the sharing is not equal. It's a special situation where oxygens love electrons. And hydrogens don't really care about electrons. And so what happens is the electrons spend most of their time around the oxygen atom. The hydrogen atoms, the electrons are there, but not as often. So what ends up happening for each water molecule is we have, I'll just draw one water molecule here. On each water molecule, because the electrons spend most of their time around the oxygen becomes a little bit negatively charged. And that's what this little sigma symbol means here. A little bit positively charged to the hydrogens, because the electrons spend most of their time around the oxygen. And so what this does is it creates what's called a polar bond, or it allows for the oxygen of one water to be attracted to the hydrogens of another water. And so these bonds here, this is the hydrogen bond, it's weaker than a covalent bond, but still significant. These hydrogen bonds pull polar molecules together, and what this does is it is going to cause basically a change in state, or it's going to be, if you take a look at water, water is liquid at STP. If you look at a molecule like carbon dioxide has a very similar chemical formula. It only has 3 atoms. It has a carbon, and it's bonded to 2 oxygens, so again 3 atoms big, but because the bonds aren't polar, this one ends up being gaseous at STP. So polar bonds can actually affect the state of a substance. You would think just by looking at a water molecule that it would be gaseous at room temperature, but because of those hydrogen bonds, because the oxygens from one molecule are attracted to the hydrogens of another molecule, it sucks all those molecules together, and water is at a liquid state at room temperature. So, examples of hydrogen bonding, there's only 3 types of hydrogen bonding that can form. Molecules that have HF, or are hydrogen bonded to a fluoride. The only example is hydrogen fluoride. It's a polar molecule. Molecules that have oxygen and hydrogen bonds are going to be polar as well. There's lots of these in nature. An example would be methanol, ethanol, all the alcohols. There's a bunch of organic acids like citric acid. All of these things have an OH. And what that means is, if we even take a look at this one, here we have the water molecule shown, but what this would mean if we just draw a quick picture is, here we have a carbon, and we'll just draw bonds to the hydrogens, and then over here is an O and an H. This is the polar part of the molecule where the oxygen's a little bit negative and the hydrogen's a little bit positive. What that means is, when another methanol molecule, or any other polar molecule is kicking around, but we'll just use another methanol just to keep it simple, this hydrogen's a little bit positive, this oxygen's a little bit negative, and what happens is we end up getting little bonds formed between the molecules. These are our hydrogen bonds. And what this does is it packs molecules closer together. You might think that a molecule with only really 3, 4, 5, 6 atoms should be gaseous at room temperature, but it turns out that it's liquid because of this hydrogen bonding. NH bonds, same idea. One example is urea, which is in P. Hydrogen bonding is crucial to biological molecules, and this is why we're spending a little bit more time talking about it. Hydrogen bonding is responsible for the shape of DNA, and DNA is that molecule that carries all of our genetic information. It's also responsible for the function and shape of proteins, and proteins are all the structures and little machines that make our body work. So hydrogen bonding is extremely important in these biological molecules that we're going to be talking about in the second half of the course. Here's a picture of DNA, and here's where you find all the hydrogen bonds. So it's a complex looking picture. We don't have to worry a lot about it except to say here we have a whole bunch of atoms that are joined by covalent bonds. They're all sharing electrons. So there's a whole bunch of atoms sharing electrons. It's quite a large structure. And again, there's more sharing in this direction and more sharing in this direction. But what happens is, at the end of these little circles are nitrogens bonded to hydrogens. And what that causes is on the other side we have another molecule with the same situation. Here we have an oxygen. Oxygens are electron-loving molecules. They're going to be attracted to the hydrogens on the other side. Here we have a nitrogen attracted to a hydrogen. Here we have another hydrogen attracted to an oxygen. So these things here cause in DNA two strands to become linked together. And these bonds are extremely important. It's the reason we are the way we are. So yeah, there you go, hydrogen bonding in DNA. So these dotted lines represent hydrogen bonding. This helps DNA pair up. So very important in DNA molecules. Some more properties of ionic and molecular compounds. Ionic compounds, all small ionic compounds are solid at STP because they're packed as a crystal. Because they're packed together, melting and boiling represent the separating of atoms, or separating of, if you look at melting and boiling, what this does is this separates molecules. It gives molecules enough energy to pull away from each other. Because in ionic compounds we're dealing with ions, almost all of them melt well over 100 degrees Celsius. Most of them boil well over 1,000 degrees Celsius. So high melting, high boiling points when we're looking at ionic compounds. Molecular compounds, the opposite is true. These are small molecules, and they're discrete. So they're usually gases. They're discrete, so they're usually gaseous or liquid. Small molecules tend to melt at temperatures well under 100 degrees Celsius, and in terms of boiling, most of them are boiling well under 200 degrees Celsius. Even the ones with hydrogen bonding are boiling and melting at relatively low temperatures when you compare them to ionic compounds. It is important to note that this hydrogen bonding attracts molecules to each other. So if molecules have hydrogen bonding, they're going to be attracted to each other. They're going to melt and boil at higher temperatures. Other properties. If we look at mechanical properties of ionic crystals, since they're not discrete, each ion is attracted to the many ions that surround it. If you put any pressure on part of the structure, what you end up doing is you end up forcing like charges beside each other. So if you hit one side, let's say we take our hammer and we whack one side of our crystal. When we do this, we temporarily line up ions of the same charge, and that causes them to push away from each other. And that's what makes crystals brittle. Most crystals you can break along certain fracture lines, and the reason they fracture in certain directions has to do with when do these like charges line up with each other. So ionic compounds are brittle. Molecular compounds, the ones that are solid, are usually very, very large. They're usually thousands of atoms in size. Here we're talking about waxes and fats. And if you just think about the texture of animal fat, It's mushy, it's squishy, it's easy to pull it into little bits, but it doesn't fracture along a clean line. It's kind of stringy. Same thing with waxes. If you take even candle wax, you can push your fingers in it. It's very bendable, and it's easy to separate wax into balls. So most molecular compounds, when they're solid, tend to be soft and easily broken because what they really are is a bunch of discrete molecules tangled up. So all you're really doing is untangling molecules as opposed to trying to there's no opposite charges to push against each other. We can talk about conductivity for the ability to conduct electricity, ionic compounds. And what we're really looking at before I go on is all of these properties are from our first lecture. So in our first lecture, we were talking about these physical and chemical properties that we can observe. And now what we're doing is we're going through these physical and chemical properties and comparing ionic compounds and molecular compounds. So ionic compounds, when they're solid, they are poor conductors. All of those ions are locked in place by neighboring ions, so there's no way for electricity or electrons to flow through the substance. As soon as you melt them, however, so if you melt them or if you dissolve them in water, they do conduct electricity. And what happens is you freed up all those ions, right? When you melt a substance, those ions become free-flowing ions around each other, and now electrons can be passed by them. Same thing in solution. Those ions are now separated from each other, and they can pass electrons or conduct electricity. The big difference is molecular compounds never conduct electricity. All of the electrons are involved in covalent bonds. So they don't want any more electrons, and they certainly aren't going to give any up. So because of these covalent bonds, there's no electricity being passed, not even nonpolar and polar, and I guess these are compounds without hydrogen bonding. And these are compounds with hydrogen bonding. Neither of them conduct electricity. The molecules might turn themselves to orientate them with the electrodes if they're polar compounds, but none of those electrons are willing to leave the compound, so we can't conduct any electricity. So from this lecture, what you should be getting is, I just put it up as a table, if you compare ionic and molecular compounds, and where this becomes important is when you're given a sample of matter and trying to figure out, well, what kind of matter is it? Is it an ionic compound or a molecular compound? Here's the checklist that you can go through. If you see something and it's solid, well, you can say, well, it could be anything. But if you see something and it's gaseous or liquid, then you know it has to be molecular at room temperature. Arrangements of atoms, this you can't see, but it might tell you how the rest of the properties go. Ionic compounds form crystal lattices. Molecular compounds form discrete molecules, and this is what causes the rest of these properties. Crystal lattices, because everything's packed together, they boil at relatively high temperatures. Discrete molecules, it's easy to separate them. Most of them boil well under 200 degrees Celsius. In terms of attractive forces, we only talk about hydrogen bonding in molecular compounds. In ionic compounds, there's only ionic bonds, it's just ions and more ions. Or positive ions with negative ions. Here, there are no ions. So there can be hydrogen bonding if there's hydrogen plus either oxygen, nitrogen, or fluorine, but there's no ions. Mechanical properties, ionic compounds tend to be brittle, they break easily and they fracture along a set line, they fracture in straight lines. Molecular compounds tend to be soft or mushy. If they are brittle, there's no fracture lines. Or they don't fracture in one specific direction, they can be broken in many different directions without much problem. Conductivity, ionic compounds, and the one you should remember for sure is when you put them in solution, when you dissolve them in water, when you dissolve them in water, they conduct electricity. Molecular compounds never do. And so that's a summary of some of the properties of ionic molecular compounds. I will see you in the next lecture.